Chapter 35. Uses of the dative case. Chapter 35 covers the following. Special uses of the dative case, including those with certain verbs that take the dative with compound verbs, the dative of possession, and the dative with certain adjectives. At the end of the lesson, we'll review the vocabulary, which you should memorize in this chapter. There are 4 important rules to remember in this chapter. Rule 1. 10 special verbs in Latin expect a noun in the dative case. Rule 2. So-called compound verbs also take dative objects, though it would be more accurate to say the compounds, that is prefixes, attached to the front of some verbs do. Rule 3. The formula for the dative of possession is a third-person form of the verb to be, esse, plus a nominative noun, plus a dative noun, rendering a translation like, there is a book, nominative, to me, dative, meaning, I have a book. Rule 4. Nouns in the dative case are used to complete the sense of certain adjectives. The dative with special verbs. This is a lesson centering on Latin idiom, expressions which will almost certainly seem odd to you because their English equivalents don't correspond to the Latin exactly, or in some cases, even closely. Chapter 35 focuses on one type of Latin idiom, those involving the dative case. In particular, 10 very common verbs which expect dative objects, technically indirect objects, not accusative ones, even though the English verbs most often used to translate them call for direct objects. In other words, the English translation doesn't correspond directly to the Latin, and thus can be misleading. Indeed, the English can make you think you'll see an accusative direct object when there will be, in fact, a dative object. The reason these 10 Latin verbs have this unexpected expectation is their underlying meaning. For instance, when the Romans heard the verb credo, to which the closest English verb in sense is believe, they didn't hear believe, but be trusting, which naturally calls for a dative, be trusting to. Here's a chart where we'll list all 10 of these verbs in the left-hand column. Immediately to the right, in the center column, we'll put the English verb, which is closest to them in sense, the word most often used to translate them, and to the far right, in the right-hand column, we'll note their literal Latin sense, what the Romans actually heard when they used this verb. Note that the English word in the middle column will expect an accusative direct object, but the literal translation in the far right column will not. It will expect a dative object because of its basic sense. For instance, credo, the first verb on this list, is most often translated believe, though its real sense is be trusting to. The second verb is ignosco, meaning pardon, but that's not its true sense in Latin. When someone said ignosco, the Romans actually heard grant pardon, a meaning that naturally expects the dative, grant pardon to. Third is impero, command, but that's not what the Romans heard when they heard impero. They heard give an order to. Next, nokeo, harm, literally do harm to. Parco, spare, literally be lenient to. Pareo, obey, literally be obedient to. Persuadio, persuade, literally make sweet or agreeable to. Placeo, please, literally be pleasing to. Servio, serve, literally be a servant or slave to. And finally, studeo, study, literally be zealous or eager for. Here are 2 sentences with examples of those special verbs and their dative objects. Crede mihi, believe me, literally be trusting to me. Hoc eis non placet, this doesn't please them, literally this is not pleasing to them. This is not hard, it's just weird. and it's a principle that involves only these 10 special verbs. You can't import the use dative with special verbs to verbs that aren't special. If you need to see more examples of these special verbs in action, Wheelock provides sentences using them at the top of page 170. And I'll include a few more examples in the vocabulary below. Seriously, there's nothing complicated about this. Frankly, nothing in this whole chapter is going to strain your brain. It's all just a bunch of words that for some reason or other call for datives, like compound verbs, another type of verb that can have a dative attached to it. Compound means the verb has a prefix. So in some cases, if a Latin verb has a prefix, it can take a dative. Actually, it's not the verb that takes the dative, it's the prefix. So it would be technically more accurate to say datives with the compound of the verb. But really, that's just being fussy. Let's leave the term as it is, as long as you understand the principle. Here's an example of a dative with a compound verb. Exercitui praesum, literally, I am, sum, in front of, prae, the army. Exercitui, meaning, I'm in charge of the army. Exercitui here is actually not the object of the verb sum. Sum can't take an object, it's intransitive. It's the object of the prefix prae on the front of the compound verb praesum. That's what the term dative with a compound verb means. The dative is the object of prae. Another way to look at it is it's a prepositional phrase that's been broken up. The preposition has been tacked onto the front of a verb, and its object is expressed in the dative, not the ablative. Here's another example. Senatus Caesarem exercitui praefecit, meaning, the Senate put Caesar at the front of, literally to, the army. It's better English to say the Senate put Caesar in charge of the army. Again, exercitui is a dative with a compound verb. And note that there is also an accusative noun here, Caesarem, the direct object of the verb facio in its perfect form fecit. So the presence of a dative with a compound verb doesn't preclude having an accusative direct object too if the verb calls for one. Here's another example. Coronam regi imposuit. He put the crown on the king. Regi is a dative with a compound verb. Technically, it's the object of the prefix im on the front of the compound verb impono, and coronam is the direct object of posuit. Not all prefixes set up the possibility of a dative with a compound verb, but many do. Wheelock lists them in footnote 3 on page 169. Ad ante, con, that's cum in compound, in inter, ob, post, prae, pro, sub, super, and sometimes re and circum. Other prefixes don't use the dative. For instance, ob, de, and ex, all meaning from one way or another. These will call for an ablative because their inherent sense of separation is so integrally associated with that case. Not that the dative can't show separation. Never mind. Dark place. Let's not go there. Yet. In the supplementary syntax at the back of the book, on pages 374 to 379, Wheelock discusses two other idiomatic uses of the dative, which you need to know. He should have included them in the formal grammar somewhere in chapters 1 through 40, so we're going to make up for that here and introduce the dative of possession and the dative with certain adjectives. Both are on page 375. First, the dative of possession, the formula for which is a nominative noun plus a third-person form of the verb to be, esse, plus a dative noun which is the actual dative of possession. The literal English equivalent will sound something like this. There is a book to me, which means I have a book. Be careful. While the to be verb is always third person, its tense and number can and often do change. For example, quondam omnibus jura haec erant. Literally, once these rights were to all people understood. Errant is plural and imperfect. A smoother English translation of this sentence would be, all people once had these rights. The final important use of the dative we'll discuss in this chapter is also the simplest, the dative with certain adjectives. Some adjectives, just by their nature, call for a dative, like charis, meaning dear, to, and jucundus, pleasant, to. To these could be added many more, such as amicus, friendly, to, par, equal, to, and similis, like, to or unto. What makes this so easy for us to learn is that the English counterparts of most of these adjectives also set up the possibility of a dative after them. When idiom matches idiom, life is idiotically sweet. Enjoy it. So let's review briefly the dative usages you just learned and frame them as the type of grammar question you'll be asked in exercises and on tests. The first is the dative with special verbs. Special verbs include those 10 we charted out above, like nokeo. For instance, nemini nokebat, meaning he did harm to no one, or in better English, he harmed no one. So if I underline nemini and ask you what case and why, say dative with a special verb. Or you can say dative with nokeo. In other words, you can cite the rule or the special verb. Both are equally correct. Second is the dative with the compound verb. More precisely, the compound of the verb, such as militibus bonum praeposui, meaning I placed posui, a good man, bonum, in front of prae, the soldiers, militibus. That is, I made a good man the soldier's commander. If I underline militibus and ask you what case and why, what would your answer be? Dative with a compound verb. But don't cite the specific verb here. Instead, say the rule with a compound verb, so I know that you know it's the prae that's tripping off the dative, not the whole verb, including posui. The posui has its own expectation, here bonum, an accusative direct object, which is also a perfectly legitimate grammar question. Next is the dative of possession, a construction consisting of a dative noun plus a nominative noun plus a third-person form of esse, as in nobis sapientia est, meaning literally, there is wisdom to us, or in other, better words, we have wisdom. What would your answer be if I underlined nobis and asked you what case and why? The dative of possession, of course. And finally, the dative with certain adjectives, really a collage of adjectives whose meaning calls for a dative, such as omnibus amici simus, let's be friends or friendly to all people. Omnibus is what case and why? Dative with a special adjective, or amicus. That's it for the grammar in this chapter. Now let's look at the vocabulary. First word, adversus a meaning opposite or adverse. It's a first-second declension adjective, one of those special adjectives which expects a dative after it, as in nobis adversus, adverse to us. The next word is a verb, impero, first conjugation, meaning give orders to or command. This is one of the 10 special verbs featured in this chapter. It takes a dative object. How would Latin say, let us not command this army? Let. How does Latin say let? Yes, the jussive subjunctive. So, what's the present tense subjunctive marker for first conjugation? Who reads a diary? She does. And the word for army will be in what case? That's right, dative. Finally, how does hic haec hoc form its dative singular? Hic haec hoc, huius huius huius, huic. So, what's the answer? Ne exercitui huic imperemus. Next is another verb, miror mirari miratus sum, meaning marvel at, admire, or wonder, a first conjugation deponent. Like the vast majority of deponents, miror expects an accusative direct object. So, how would Latin say, if someone should flee danger, why would I admire him? I told you we'd practice sentences in this vocabulary. Do I lie? Okay, let's take this one thing at a time. What kind of condition uses should would? FLV, which in Latin has what tense and mood? Present subjunctive. How do you say someone after if? After si, nisi, nomene. Yeah, Ollie takes a holiday, so it'll be si quis. And the translation? Si quis periculum fugiat, cur eum mirere. And here's another verb, noceo nocere, nocui nocitum, meaning do harm to, harm, or injure. Its second conjugation, and another of those special verbs which take the dative. The last principal part, nocitum, hints that this verb has a passive, which it does, but it doesn't. No true passive. Nocitum is necessary to see how to form nociturus, the future active participle, which is used in the future active infinitive, which is seen often in indirect statement. So you need to know the perfect passive base nocit, but you won't actually see it as a real passive, because this verb doesn't have a real passive. Latin can't use noceo, or indeed any of this chapter's special verbs that take the dative, in a true passive sense. These verbs don't have direct objects, so there's nothing to turn into the subject in a passive context, and the one thing verbs have to have is a subject. So, no true passives with any of the special verbs in this chapter. How would Latin say, no one will harm her? What case will her be? Dative. And what conjugation is noceo? Second. How's the future formed in second? Bi. So, nemo ei nocebit. Or you can use illi or huic, or isti if for some reason you don't like her. Next is parco parcere peperci parsurus, meaning be lenient to or spare, a third conjugation verb, yet another special verb that takes the dative. The last principal part, parsurus, is the future active participle. It's cited in place of the perfect passive participle because, as we just noted, none of these special verbs have true passives. Think about it. You can't be leniented to. Note the reduplication in the third principal part, peperci. By now, reduplication in the perfect active should come as no surprise to you. How would Latin say, who spared, use the perfect, that most wretched city? Remember, you can't say it exactly that way. You have to change the English to make it conform better to the Latin. Can you say spare plus an accusative direct object? No. So, rephrase it the way Latin would say this. Who was lenient to that most wretched city? So what's the Latin? Quis urbi miserimae pepercit. The next word is another special verb. Pareo parere parui, meaning be obedient to or obey. Second conjugation. It takes the dative. And be careful, it looks a lot like paro parare, first conjugation, meaning prepare, provide, or get. Very different verbs with very different meanings. Speaking of which, the meaning of pareo is for some reason hard for English speakers to memorize. No doubt in part because English contains all but no notable derivatives of pareo. Past students of mine have found it useful to remember pareo this way. Who do you obey? Your parents, of course. Etymologically, that's a totally invalid correlation. Our word parent comes from a different Latin verb, pario, parere, meaning give birth. But if this memory hook works, who cares? All it has to do is help you remember what pareo means. So how would Latin say, you plural ought, use debeo, to obey your father and mother? Patri, matrique, vestri, you can put that in or not, parere, debetis. Literally, you ought to be obedient to your father and mother. Next up, persuadio, persuadere, persuasi, persuasum, meaning make sweet to or persuade, a second conjugation verb, another special verb that takes the dative. Literally, it means to make thoroughly, sweet, swad, to. That is, to sugarcoat something so that someone will swallow it. One way to look at persuasion. The Romans' natural suspicion of slick arguments, the sort of subtle thinking they associated with the Greeks, is not well hidden here. As if with this one word they were saying, listen to enough sweetened Greek philosophy, and you'll start believing that money is bad, and children don't have to be obedient to their parents. Persuasion is nothing but a dangerous and tasty drug. Stop thinking and start fighting for Rome. Name one empire that philosophy has ever built. Swad. Interesting base. What do you think that turned into in English? According to Grimm's law, D changes into T, compare dent and tooth, so in English, swad became sweet. Here's another special verb, placeo, placere, placui, placitum, meaning be pleasing to or please, a second conjugation verb. That takes the dative. How would Latin say, if they had remained there, they would have pleased us more? What kind of condition? Past contrary to fact, which uses what tense and mood? Pluperfect subjunctive, and more. What is that? An adjective? An adverb? An adverb. It modifies pleased, not us. So what's the comparative of greatly? Magnopere. Magis. And so what's the Latin translation for the full sentence? Si ibi remansissent nobis, remember placio takes the dative, magis placuissent. And here's yet another special verb, servio, servire, servivi, servitum, meaning be a servant to or serve. A fourth conjugation verb that takes the dative. Be careful not to confuse this verb with servo, servare, to save. Watch for the I in servio, the serve verb, as in serviant, meaning let them serve, or they serve subjunctively. I chose the subjunctive here not to be mean, or not just to be mean, but to remind you about A's in present tense forms. A signals the present subjunctive in third IO, and fourth. How about servant, then, meaning they save indicatively? Sure looks a lot like English servant, doesn't it? But it's not. The sign at Roman restaurants reads, no eye, no service. Another thing to note about these verbs is that the servo save verb creates compounds. Conservo, reservo, whereas the servio serve verb never has compounds. So, you see serva with a prefix, it means save. One last thing to note about this verb, the perfect can be servii versus servivi. We've mentioned before the pattern where Latin drops W sounds in between vowels. Remember dives, divitis, or ditis, meaning rich man? Okay, then, remember it next time. Discipuli. The next to last special verb on this vocabulary list is studio, studere, studui, meaning direct one's zeal to, be eager for, or study, a second conjugation verb, plus dative. Finally, here's a noun, premium primii, neuter, meaning reward or prize. It's second declension neuter, so its accusative plural will be primia. Next is a prefix, pri, meaning before, in front of, or forth. And here is a compound verb, antepono, anteponere, antepossui, antepositum, meaning put before or prefer, third conjugation. It expects, as many compound verbs do, two nouns in different cases, an accusative, the direct object of the verb itself, pono, and a dative, which is a dative with a compound verb, or better, the compound of the verb ante, meaning before. How would Latin say, all people prefer love to war? The big question here is, which noun will be accusative, that is, the object of the verb pono in the compound antepono? Love. And which will be dative, the object of the ante prefix on the front of antepono? War. So, omnes amorem bello anteponunt. And the last special verb, the last word to learn here, is ignosco ignoscere, ignoi ignotum, meaning grant pardon to or forgive. It's a third conjugation verb, and it expects a noun in the dative case. Its elements are interesting and worth noting. The prefix in, here just I, means not. The base gno means no, Grimm's law, G equals K. And sc is the inchoative affix, meaning begin. Note that, as is the rule, the inchoative affix is dropped in the perfect, ignoi and ignotum, where begin has no place. So, altogether, igno-sco means literally, I begin not to know. When the Romans heard that, they understood, failed to acknowledge, most often a crime someone's committed, which is one way of saying it's forgiven. A crime can't be a crime until it's recognized as such. If the Romans wanted to say not know or be unaware of, that is, actually be ignorant, they had to deploy a different verb, like ignoro or nescio. Remember, most judges will not pardon ignorance of the law, nor will I fail to acknowledge unawareness of Latin. Get to work memorizing the vocabulary in this chapter. Do the rules that were cited at the beginning of this chapter now make sense to you? If not, please review this presentation. If so, please proceed to the next slide. For the next class meeting, please bring in a copy of the Practice and Review Sentences for Chapter 35 on page 170 and 171 of Wheelock's text. Si haec omnia studio quam maximo discere voletis, multa beneficia accipietis o discipuli mei.